The January wind howled across Pinewood Valley like a living thing, clawing at windows and shaking the bare branches of cottonwoods until they cracked like rifle shots. 16-year-old Lily Brennan pulled her coat tighter as she trudged along the frozen edge of Willowbrook Creek, her boots punching through the crusted snow with each step. The cold bit at her cheeks and turned her breath into white clouds that vanished almost as soon as they formed. She had taken this route 100 times before, cutting across the old property to avoid the main road, but tonight something felt different. The air carried a weight that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She almost missed it. The sound came first, thin and desperate, cutting through the monotonous roar of wind. Lily stopped, her heart stuttering in her chest. It came again, sharper this time, a high-pitched cry that made her think of something small and terrified. She turned toward the source, squinting through the swirling snow toward the dark silhouette of her grandfather's old barn. The building had stood empty for 8 years, ever since he passed, its doors sealed with rusted chains her father had never bothered to remove. But the sound was coming from behind it, near the creek bank where the willows grew thick. Lily's fingers trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket, the screen casting a pale blue glow across her face. She almost called her father, but he was 3 states away on a haul and wouldn't be back until Thursday. She hesitated, then slipped the phone back into her coat. Whatever was making that sound needed help now, not in 3 days. She pushed forward, fighting against drifts that rose past her knees in places, her jeans soaking through with icy water. The willows appeared like skeletal fingers reaching up from the snow, and as she rounded the corner of the barn, she saw them. 2 foals, so young they still had the gangly proportions of babies, lay tangled in heavy chains near a rotting fence post. One was pale as moonlight, its coat dulled by frost and exhaustion. The other was darker, a rich bay color that showed even beneath the layer of snow clinging to its body. Both were shaking violently, their sides heaving with each labored breath. Steam rose from their nostrils in frantic bursts as they struggled against the metal that bound their legs. The chains had been looped and padlocked, secured to a stake driven so deep into the frozen ground that it hadn't budged despite their efforts to break free. Lily's stomach turned over. She had seen horses before, had even ridden a few times at summer camp years ago, but nothing had prepared her for this. These weren't full-grown animals left to fend for themselves. These were babies, maybe 6 months old at most, deliberately chained and abandoned in the worst cold snap Montana had seen in 20 years. The pale one lifted its head as she approached, eyes wide and liquid with fear. The darker foal thrashed harder, foam gathering at the corners of its mouth as it tried to lunge away from her. "Easy," Lily whispered, her voice shaking almost as much as her hands. The word came out rough, barely audible over the wind, but she forced herself to keep talking. "I'm not going to hurt you. Promise. I'm going to help." She dropped to her knees in the snow, ignoring the cold that immediately soaked through her jeans. Her art teacher had once told her that frightened things needed to see you were no threat, that staying low and moving slowly could mean the difference between trust and terror. She had been talking about sketching wild birds, but Lily hoped the principle held true for horses. The chains were thick, industrial grade, the kind used to tow trucks or secure cargo. Each link was as wide as her thumb, and the padlocks gleamed dully in the dim light from her phone. She pulled at them uselessly, knowing even as she did that she had no chance of breaking them without tools. The stake had been hammered at least 2 feet into earth that had frozen solid as concrete. Whoever had done this had planned it carefully, had wanted to make sure these animals stayed exactly where they were left. Anger flared hot in Lily's chest, burning away some of the numbness that had lived there since her mother's funeral 3 months ago. She had spent so long feeling nothing, moving through her days like a ghost in her own life, that the sudden rush of fury almost made her dizzy. How could someone do this? How could anyone look at something this small and helpless and decide its life meant nothing? The pale foal whinnied softly, a sound so plaintive it cracked something inside her. She needed help. She needed tools, blankets, food, a way to get them somewhere warm. But the nearest neighbor was Tommy Reeves' grandmother, and she was nearly 80 with a bad hip. Murphy's feed and supply would be closed by now, and the veterinary clinic was on the far side of town. Her father's truck was parked at the cottage, but she had never driven anything bigger than her friend's sedan, and the storm was getting worse by the minute. The road would be treacherous, maybe impassable within the hour. Lily looked back at the foals, at the way they pressed close to each other despite the chains that kept them half-tangled. The darker one had stopped thrashing and was watching her now with eyes that held something beyond animal fear. It looked almost knowing, as if it understood that she was all that stood between them and a frozen death in the dark. The pale one's head had drooped low, exhaustion winning over panic. She could see its ribs pressing against its sides with each breath, could count the vertebrae along its spine. She made her decision. First, she needed to calm them down enough that they wouldn't hurt themselves fighting the chains. Then she needed to get them warm, or at least warmer than they were now. After that, she could figure out the rest. Lily pulled off her scarf, the thick wool one her mother had knitted 2 winters ago in shades of deep blue and gray. She had worn it every day since the funeral, unable to let go of the last thing her mother's hands had made. Now she wrapped it carefully around the pale foal's neck, tucking the ends against its chest where the cold had settled deepest. The foal flinched at first, then stilled, as if surprised by the gesture. Lily's coat came off next, her fingers already going numb as she draped it over the darker foal's back. The animal snorted, ears flicking back, but didn't pull away. She was left in just her hoodie and soaked jeans, the wind cutting through the thin fabric like it wasn't there at all, but she barely noticed. For the first time in months, she had something to focus on besides the empty chair at the dinner table and the bedroom door that stayed closed because opening it hurt too much. The storm had settled into a steady assault by the time Lily realized she couldn't leave them to search for help. Every minute she spent away would be a minute closer to hypothermia for the foals, and she had no guarantee she could even make it back through the drifts that were already waist-high in places. The wind shrieked around the barn, driving snow horizontal across the open field. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing, the world reduced to shades of gray and white that blurred together until she couldn't tell where the ground ended and the sky began. She needed to think. Her grandfather had kept tools in the barn. She remembered that much, though she had no idea if any of them were still there or if they had been sold off years ago. The building itself was locked, but there was a window on the north side that had always stuck, the wood frame swollen from decades of moisture. She had crawled through it once as a kid, playing hide and seek with cousins during a family reunion. If she could get inside, maybe she could find something, anything that would help. Lily stood on shaking legs, her body protesting the movement after kneeling in the snow. She looked down at the foals, at the scarf and coat that were already dusted white with fresh snowfall. "Stay here," she said, then almost laughed at the absurdity of it. They were chained. They had no choice but to stay. She stumbled around the barn, using the wall for support as the wind tried to knock her sideways. The window was still there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Glass intact but frame as warped as she remembered. She dug her fingers under the sill and pulled, muscles straining. Nothing. She tried again, throwing her weight into it and felt something give. The window shrieked open 6 inches, then a foot, just barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. The barn's interior was pitch black and smelled of old hay, dust, and something else she couldn't quite place. Decay, maybe, or just the particular scent of abandonment. She used her phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness thick enough to feel solid. Shadows jumped and twisted as she swept the light across the space, revealing cobwebs stretched between rafters and the humped shapes of old equipment covered in tarps. Her grandfather had been a horse trainer, one of the best in the valley, and the barn still held remnants of that life. Bridles hung from hooks, their leather cracked and stiff. A saddle sat propped in the corner, its stirrups touching the floor. And there, on a workbench against the far wall, she saw what she needed. Tools. Rusted and ancient, but tools nonetheless. A hacksaw, bolt cutters, a hammer, coils of rope that might still hold despite their age. Lily grabbed everything she could carry, shoving smaller items into her hoodie pocket and clutching the larger ones against her chest. She also found horse blankets, the heavy canvas kind designed to withstand Montana winters, and a metal bucket that had somehow escaped the rust that claimed everything else. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had 5 minutes ago. Getting back out through the window proved harder than getting in. She had to pass the tools through first, laying them carefully in the snow, then haul herself up and over the sill. Her arms shook with effort, muscles already exhausted from fighting through drifts and cold. She dropped gracelessly into the snow on the other side, landing hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. For a moment she just lay there, staring up at the black sky, feeling the storm press down on her with physical weight. Then she heard it again, that desperate whinny, and she was moving. The foals hadn't moved, couldn't move, but the pale one lifted its head as she appeared around the corner. Recognition flickered in its eyes, or maybe that was just what Lily wanted to see. She set down the tools and spread one of the blankets over both animals, tucking it around their bodies as best she could with the chains in the way. The second blanket she folded and placed beneath them, giving them something besides frozen ground to lie on. They were still shivering, still in danger, but at least they had some protection now. The bolt cutters were old, their handles rough with rust, but when Lily squeezed them around the first chain link, she felt it give slightly. Hope flared in her chest. She braced her feet and put everything she had into it, ignoring the way the metal handles bit into her palms even through her gloves. The chain resisted, held, then suddenly snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The pale foal jerked at the noise but didn't bolt. One leg was free. Lily moved to the next chain, then the next, working methodically despite the way her hands cramped and her shoulders screamed in protest. The darker foal fought her at first, tossing its head and trying to scramble away, but there was nowhere to go with 3 legs still bound. She paused, breathing hard, and did something her mother used to do when Lily had nightmares. She hummed, low and steady, not quite a song but not quite random notes either. Just sound, something to fill the terrible silence between wind gusts. The foal's ears swiveled toward her, and gradually, its struggles subsided. By the time she cut the last chain, Lily's hands were bleeding inside her gloves, torn open by the rough metal and the repetitive motion. She couldn't feel the pain yet, adrenaline and cold combining to numb everything, but she saw the dark stains spreading across the wool and knew she would pay for this later. The foal stood on trembling legs, free for the first time in who knew how long. The pale one took a tentative step toward her, nostrils flaring as it tested her scent. The darker one circled once, testing its freedom, then moved to stand beside its companion. Now came the hard part. Lily had freed them, but they were still in the middle of a blizzard with temperatures dropping toward 0. The barn was the only shelter within reach, and getting them inside meant convincing them to follow her. She had no lead rope, no halter, nothing but her voice and her desperate hope that whatever instinct made horses trust humans in the first place would be enough. She picked up the bucket, scooped it full of snow, and started walking toward the barn's main door. Behind her, she heard the crunch of small hooves in snow. She didn't look back, didn't want to spook them, just kept moving and praying they would follow. The barn door had been chained shut, but the chains were external and old enough that they broke on her second swing with the hammer. The sound echoed across the empty field, swallowed almost immediately by the storm. Lily hauled the door open, its hinges screaming, and stepped inside. The darkness was absolute, her phone's battery dying after being exposed to the cold for so long. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the swirling white, and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the pale foal appeared at the threshold, head low, legs shaking so badly it could barely stand. It looked at the dark interior, then at Lily, then took one careful step across the threshold. The darker foal followed, moving faster, as if afraid of being left alone in the storm. Once both were inside, Lily pulled the door shut, plunging them all into blackness broken only by the thin gray light filtering through cracks in the walls. She had done it, against every odd, with nothing but desperation and her dead mother's scarf. She had gotten them to safety. Lily sank down onto the floor, her back against the wall, and let herself shake. The foals stood nearby, their breathing loud in the enclosed space, alive and free and warm enough to survive the night. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the abandoned barn that smelled of her grandfather's memory and decades of horses long gone, something fragile and new had taken root. She didn't have a name for it yet, didn't know if it was hope or purpose or just the stubborn refusal to let one more thing die on her watch. But it was there, burning small and steady in her chest, and for now that was enough. Lily woke to gray light filtering through the gaps in the barn walls and the sound of restless hooves shuffling against old floorboards. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache, muscles stiff from sleeping upright against the wall with her knees drawn to her chest. The cold had seeped into her bones during the night, and when she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. She caught herself against a support beam, splinters digging into her palm as she steadied herself and waited for circulation to return. The foals stood near the far corner where she had left them, huddled together beneath the blankets that had shifted during the night. The pale one watched her with large, dark eyes that seemed too knowing for such a young creature. The darker foal pawed at the ground, restless energy radiating from its compact body despite the ordeal it had survived. Both were alive. Both were standing. That alone felt like a miracle worth the pain now shooting through Lily's frozen joints. She fumbled for her phone, squinting at the screen's harsh brightness. For % battery remaining, and a string of missed calls from her father that must have come through before the storm knocked out the cell tower. The time read 6:43 in the morning, which meant she had been gone from home for nearly 11 hours. Her father would be frantic when he finally got through, but there was nothing she could do about that now. She needed water for the foals, food if she could find any, and a way to keep them warm through another day and night before she could figure out what came next. The barn held more than she remembered once daylight revealed its contents. Her grandfather's old tack room had survived mostly intact, protected by a door that had swollen shut but hadn't rotted through. She forced it open with her shoulder, wincing at the protest from muscles already taxed beyond their limit. Inside, dusty shelves held remnants of a life spent with horses. Bottles of supplements with faded labels, grooming brushes with worn bristles, a first aid kit that might still contain something useful. And there, on the bottom shelf, 3 sealed bags of senior horse feed that must have been left behind when the barn was abandoned. Lily tore open one bag, the sweet smell of molasses and grain making her own stomach clench with hunger. She hadn't eaten since lunch the previous day, a granola bar consumed between classes that now felt like it had happened in another lifetime. But the foals needed this more than she did. She poured feed into the bucket she had brought from outside, added some of the melting snow, and carried it carefully back to where they waited. The pale foal approached first, nose extended, nostrils flaring as it tested the offering. When its muzzle dipped into the bucket, Lily felt a surge of relief so intense it made her lightheaded. The darker foal held back, circling twice before curiosity overcame caution. Soon both were eating, their muzzles bumping together as they competed for access to the bucket. The sound of their chewing filled the barn with something that felt dangerously close to normalcy, as if horses eating breakfast in an abandoned barn was the most natural thing in the world. While they ate, Lily explored further. The barn was larger than it appeared from outside, with 3 separate stalls that had once housed her grandfather's training horses, a hay loft that still held ancient bales turned to dust, and a small office where he had kept records in leather-bound ledgers. She found those ledgers now, stacked on a desk beneath a window so filmed with grime it barely admitted light. Her grandfather's handwriting marched across the pages in neat columns, documenting every horse he had worked with, their temperaments, their progress, their eventual sales or returns to owners. She flipped through pages at random, reading entries about a mare with trust issues who learned to accept a saddle after 6 months of patient work, a gelding who refused jumps until the day he didn't, a young stallion whose spirit couldn't be broken and shouldn't be. Her grandfather's philosophy emerged from these pages, a conviction that horses were partners rather than property, that training meant communication rather than domination. Lily had been too young to understand this when he was alive, but reading his words now, she felt the weight of inherited wisdom settling onto her shoulders. A sound outside jerked her attention from the ledgers. Voices, muffled by the barn walls but unmistakably human. Lily's heart kicked into a sprint. She moved to the window, rubbing at the grime until she could see through a clear patch the size of her palm. Two figures trudged through the snow toward the barn. One tall and broad, the other small and bundled in layers that made walking awkward. As they drew closer, recognition flooded through her. Tommy Reeves and his grandmother, Mrs. Reeves, who must be out of her mind with worry if she had made the trek from her house in this weather. Lily ran to the door and hauled it open, cold air rushing in to steal what little warmth the barn had accumulated overnight. Tommy's face lit up when he saw her, his cheeks red from cold above the scarf wound around his neck. "Miss Lily," he shouted, his voice cracking with relief. "We thought you froze. Your dad called everybody looking for you. He tried to come home, but the roads are all closed and he's stuck in Idaho, and Mrs. Murphy said you probably went to the barn because you always go there when you're sad, and we brought supplies." Mrs. Reeves reached the door, breathing hard, leaning heavily on the walking stick she used for her bad hip. Her eyes swept over Lily, cataloging the soaked jeans, the missing coat, the bloody gloves, and her expression shifted from relief to concern in the space of a heartbeat. "Child," she said, her voice stern but gentle, "what have you gotten yourself into?" Lily stepped aside, gesturing into the barn's dim interior. The foals had retreated to the far corner at the sound of voices, pressed against each other with ears pinned back and eyes showing white. Tommy saw them and froze, his mouth falling open. Mrs. Reeves went very still, her weathered hand tightening on her walking stick until her knuckles showed pale through papery skin. "Holy heaven," Mrs. Reeves whispered. "Are those what I think they are?" Lily nodded, exhaustion making her words come slow and thick. "I found them last night, chained by the creek. I couldn't just leave them there." She heard how inadequate that sounded, how it failed to capture the desperation of the night before, the terrible certainty that walking away meant leaving them to die. But Mrs. Reeves seemed to understand what Lily couldn't articulate. The old woman's eyes, faded blue behind thick glasses, softened with something that looked like pride mixed with sorrow. Tommy had already moved past them, approaching the foals with the fearless curiosity of childhood. He moved slowly, hands extended, making soft clicking sounds with his tongue. The pale foal watched him come, trembling but not retreating. The darker one shifted its weight, muscles bunching as if preparing to bolt. But there was nowhere to go, and Tommy seemed to understand this. He stopped just out of reach and settled himself cross-legged in the straw, becoming small and unthreatening. Mrs. Reeves set down the canvas bag she had been carrying, grunting with effort. "We brought what we could," she said, pulling out items one by one. "Thermos of hot soup, sandwiches, blankets, extra batteries for your phone." She paused, looking at Lily with an expression that was hard to read. "And I called Dr. Wells before we left. She's trying to get through, but the roads are bad. She said to keep them warm and quiet until she can make it out here." The mention of Dr. Wells sent a wave of relief through Lily so strong it made her sway. The veterinarian would know what to do, how to check if the foals had suffered permanent damage from the cold and the chains, whether they needed medicine or special care. But relief was quickly followed by anxiety. Dr. Wells would have questions. She would want to know where the foals came from, who had chained them, whether Lily had reported it to authorities. And once those questions started, there would be no controlling where they led. Tommy had coaxed the pale foal closer, his small hand now resting on its neck while he murmured words too soft for Lily to hear. The foal's eyes had half closed, as if the simple comfort of gentle touch was enough to override days or weeks of fear and pain. The darker foal remained apart, watching, but its ears had pricked forward with interest rather than alarm. Mrs. Reeves watched this with the same expression Lily's mother used to get when observing something that touched her deeply, a softness around the eyes and mouth that spoke of memories and hopes tangled together. "That boy has his grandfather's gift," Mrs. Reeves said quietly. "Could calm a wild mustang just by breathing near it." She shifted her weight, grimacing as her hip protested. "You did a brave thing, Lily, a hard thing. But bravery doesn't end with the rescue. You understand that, don't you?" Someone put those chains on. Someone left them to die. And that someone might come looking. The words settled into Lily's stomach like stones. She had been so focused on immediate survival, on cutting chains and finding shelter, that she hadn't let herself think beyond the next hour. But Mrs. Reeves was right. Foals didn't chain themselves. Someone had done this deliberately, and people who could commit such cruelty rarely accepted loss without retaliation. The note from the original story rose in her mind, though no such note existed in her reality yet. Just the certainty that winter had a way of making desperate people do desperate things. The soup was vegetable beef, thick and salty, and it burned going down Lily's throat in a way that made her realize how cold she had become. She ate standing up, watching Tommy work his small miracle with the foals while Mrs. Reeves lowered herself carefully onto an overturned crate. The old woman pulled out her own phone, frowning at the screen. Still no signal. Storm must have taken out more than one tower. She looked up at Lily. Your father's beside himself. The second the road's clear, he'll be racing back here. Until then, you're stuck with me and this one as supervision. Tommy had produced an apple from somewhere in his coat. Holding it out on his flat palm the way Lily's grandfather's ledgers said you should. The pale foal lipped at it delicately, then took a bite, juice running down its chin. The darker foal edged closer, jealousy overcoming fear, and Tommy laughed with pure delight. They're so little, he said, wonder filling his voice. How old do you think they are? 6 months maybe, Lily said, though she was guessing based on nothing but their size and the gawky proportions of their legs. Too young to be away from their mothers. Too young to survive on their own. The implications of that sat heavy between them. These foals had been stolen or sold or abandoned by someone who should have protected them, left to die in a storm that would have erased all evidence of the crime. Mrs. Reeves stood with visible effort, using her walking stick to lever herself upright. I'm going to walk back and try calling Dr. Wells from higher ground. There's a spot past the ridge where you can sometimes catch a signal even when the towers are down. She fixed Lily with a stern look. You stay here. Keep them calm. Don't try to move them anywhere. And if anyone comes around asking questions, you tell them to speak to me first. Understand? Lily nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood anything anymore. The world had tilted sideways in the space of one night, reordering itself around 2 small horses who shouldn't have lived but did. Mrs. Reeves made her way to the door, moving carefully through the snow, and disappeared around the corner of the barn. Tommy remained absorbed in the foals, now attempting to brush the pale one's mane with his fingers while humming something that might have been a lullaby or might have been a song from a cartoon. The sound filled the barn with an innocence that felt both fragile and necessary. Lily finished the soup and started on a sandwich, forcing herself to eat even though exhaustion had stolen her appetite. She needed strength for whatever came next, whether that was Dr. Wells' arrival or the confrontation Mrs. Reeves seemed certain was coming. The barn felt smaller now with daylight revealing its dimensions, the walls closer than they had seemed in darkness. But it also felt safer, as if the building itself had decided to shelter them all, humans and horses alike, against the storm still raging beyond its walls. The darker foal finally approached Tommy, drawn by the boy's unshakable calm and the promise of more apple. It sniffed his outstretched hand, then his hair, then his coat, gathering information through scent in the way horses do. Tommy held perfectly still, barely breathing, until the foal's muzzle bumped against his chest. The contact seemed to satisfy something in both of them. The foal relaxed fractionally, its weight settling back onto all 4 legs instead of coiled to flee. Tommy smiled, the expression so full of joy it hurt to witness. They need names, he announced, as if this was the most important task facing them. This one's going to be Frost because he's white like snow. And this one should be Ember because his eyes are like fire. He looked at Lily for approval, his own eyes hopeful behind the smudged lenses of glasses that had fogged in the barn's warmer air. Lily felt something catch in her throat. Her mother had named things too, believing that names gave shape to formless feelings, that calling something by a specific word made it real in a way silence never could. Frost and Ember, she repeated, testing the words. They fit, somehow, capturing something essential about each foal's nature. The pale one's quiet steadiness, the darker one's barely contained energy. Okay, frost and ember it is. Tommy beamed, returning his attention to the foals with renewed purpose. He was telling them their names now, repeating them over and over as if the repetition alone could teach the horses what they were called. Frost responded by leaning into Tommy's touch, eyes half closing again. Ember remained more alert, head high, ears swiveling to catch every sound that penetrated the barn walls. Lily wondered what they had experienced before the chains, whether they had ever known kindness or if cruelty was all they understood of human contact. The morning stretched on, marked by the gradual strengthening of light through the barn's cracks and the slow warming of air that had been bitter cold at dawn. Lily found more feed for the foals, mixed it with melted snow in the bucket, and was rewarded with enthusiastic eating that suggested their appetites were recovering. She also found old wool blankets in a trunk, musty but intact, and layered them over the horse blankets she had used the night before. Frost and Ember tolerated this attention, growing accustomed to the presence of humans who touched without hurting. Tommy talked almost constantly, his voice a steady stream of observations and questions and stories about his own life. He told the foals about his parents who worked in Helena and only came home on weekends, about the cat he wanted but couldn't have because his grandmother was allergic, about the project he was building in school with popsicle sticks and glue. The foals seemed to listen, or at least they didn't move away, which Tommy took as encouragement. Lily found herself listening too, drawn into the simple narrative of a child's life that continued regardless of adult complications. By the time Mrs. Reeves returned, trudging back through snow that had finally stopped falling, Lily had nearly convinced herself that everything would be fine. Dr. Wells would come, would examine the foals and declare them healthy, and somehow the question of where they came from would resolve itself without disaster. But the expression on Mrs. Reeves' face when she appeared in the doorway killed that hope before it could fully form. "We have a problem," Mrs. Reeves said without preamble. "Dr. Wells is coming, should be here within the hour. But I ran into Pete Morrison at the ridge. He was looking for lost livestock. Said several people in the valley reported animals missing after the storm." She paused, her pale eyes meeting Lily's. "He's asking questions. About foals specifically. Says someone's offering a reward for information about 2 young horses that went missing from a trailer 3 nights ago." The sandwich turned to ash in Lily's mouth. She forced herself to swallow, to think through the implications. If someone was actively looking, if a reward was involved, then this wasn't simple abandonment. This was theft or a sale gone wrong, or something else equally complicated and dangerous. And now she was in possession of stolen property, even if she had found them chained and dying. The law rarely cared about intention when money and ownership were involved. "What do we do?" Lily asked, hearing how young she sounded, how frightened. Mrs. Reeves lowered herself onto the crate again, the walking stick clattering against the floor. "We tell the truth. We document everything. And we make sure Dr. Wells sees those chain marks before anyone else comes around." She reached into her coat and pulled out a digital camera, old but functional. "Start taking pictures. Everything. The marks on their legs, the broken chains, the stake you cut them from. The more evidence we have, the stronger our position." Lily took the camera with numb fingers. She had studied photography in art class, knew about composition and lighting and telling stories through images. But this was different. This was documentation of a crime, evidence that would be examined and questioned and possibly used against her if things went wrong. She made herself focus on the technical aspects, on capturing clear shots of the raw patches where chains had rubbed through fur to skin, the swelling around Frost's left fetlock, the way Ember favored its right foreleg. Through the camera lens, the foals became evidence rather than living creatures, and she hated that transformation even as she understood its necessity. Tommy had gone quiet, sensing the shift in atmosphere. He sat with Frost's head resting against his shoulder, his small hand stroking the white coat with mechanical repetition. "What happens if the bad people come?" he asked, his voice smaller than Lily had ever heard it. Mrs. Reeves looked at him with an expression that held both love and sorrow. "Then we stand between them and these babies. We show them the pictures. We tell them what condition you found them in. and we let the law decide who has the right to claim ownership of creatures they left to freeze. But what if the law's on their side? Lily asked. What if they can prove ownership and we have to give Frost and Ember back? The old woman's jaw tightened. Then we make sure the authorities know exactly what kind of care these animals received under that ownership. We document everything so thoroughly that even if they get them back, they'll be watched. She stood again, moving to the door to peer out at the gray day. Dr. Wells will know what to do. She's seen this before, seen animals caught between cruelty and law. Trust her. Lily wanted to trust, wanted to believe that doing the right thing would be enough. But her mother's death had taught her that the universe didn't reward goodness or punish cruelty with any consistency. Sometimes terrible things happened and no amount of effort or love could prevent them. She finished documenting the foals, capturing every angle of their injuries, then turned the camera on the chains themselves. The metal looked even more sinister in daylight, its weight and thickness making clear that these weren't restraints designed for horses, but for something much larger and more dangerous. The sound of an engine, struggling through snow, announced Dr. Wells' arrival before her truck appeared. The old green Ford rounded the barn's corner in four-wheel drive, tires throwing up waves of white as it fought for purchase on the slick ground. The veterinarian climbed out, a woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a bun, and the kind of face that had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. She hauled 2 bags from the truck bed, waving off Mrs. Reeves' offer of help, and strode into the barn with the confidence of someone completely comfortable with her purpose. "Show me," Dr. Wells said, and Lily did. She explained finding them in the storm, the chains, the night in the barn, everything she could remember through the fog of exhaustion and fear. Dr. Wells listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes already assessing the foals from a distance. When Lily finished, the veterinarian nodded once and set down her bags. "I need everyone except Lily to step outside," Dr. Wells said. "Not because I don't trust you, Tommy, but because they're calmer with fewer people around and I need them calm for this examination." Tommy looked like he might argue, but Mrs. Reeves placed a hand on his shoulder, steering him gently toward the door. They stood just outside, visible through the gap, close enough to help if needed but far enough to give the full space. Dr. Wells approached Frost first, moving with the same unhurried patience Tommy had shown. She spoke in a low voice, words Lily couldn't quite hear, but that seemed to soothe the young horse. Her hands moved over Frost's body with practiced efficiency, checking teeth and gums, listening to heart and lungs through a stethoscope, palpating legs and belly with careful pressure. Frost stood for it, trembling slightly but not pulling away. When Dr. Wells reached the injured leg, she knelt in the straw and examined the damage with a gentleness that made Lily's throat tight. "This wasn't an accident," Dr. Wells said, her voice flat with controlled anger. "These chains were on for at least 48 hours, maybe longer. See how the tissue damage goes deep? That's not from struggling for a few minutes. That's from sustained pressure while the animal was too weak to fight back." She pulled out her own camera and took pictures from angles Lily hadn't thought of, documenting details that spoke to someone with veterinary training. Ember proved more difficult. The dark foal shied when Dr. Wells approached, backing into the corner until there was nowhere left to go. Its eyes rolled white and its hooves struck out, though the blows lacked real force behind them. Dr. Wells didn't push. She simply stood at a distance and waited, her bag open, making no sudden movements. 5 minutes passed. 10. Lily was about to suggest they try again later when Ember's curiosity overcame its fear. The foal stretched its neck toward Dr. Wells, nostrils flaring, and the veterinarian allowed the inspection without moving. "Smart one," Dr. Wells murmured. "You know humans can't be trusted, but you want to hope anyway. Don't you?" She slowly extended her hand, palm down, letting Ember smell her skin. The foal snorted, then took a tentative step forward. Dr. Wells remained frozen until Ember was close enough to touch. Only then did she begin the examination, working twice as fast as she had with Frost because she knew the tolerance window was smaller. When she finished, Dr. Wells sat back on her heels and looked at Lily with an expression that held both admiration and concern. "You saved their lives. No question about that. Another night in that storm and we'd be looking at corpses. But the situation's complicated. These foals are valuable, probably purebred quarter horses based on their build. Someone's going to want them back, and that someone's going to have paperwork proving ownership. Even if they chained them and left them to die. Lily asked, hearing the desperation in her own voice. Dr. Wells stood, brushing straw from her knees. Especially then. Because admitting you found them alive means admitting what happened to them. And people who commit this kind of cruelty rarely confess without a fight. She closed her bags with sharp clicks. Here's what's going to happen. I'm filing a report with Sheriff Holland documenting their condition and the circumstances of their rescue. I'm recommending they remain in your custody until the investigation concludes. And I'm making damn sure everyone in this valley knows these babies were found chained in a blizzard. She looked at Mrs. Reeves through the doorway. Grace Murphy needs to know. If anyone can mobilize this community, it's her. Mrs. Reeves nodded, already pulling out her phone. I'll handle Grace. You handle the sheriff. Dr. Wells turned back to Lily. They're going to need consistent care. Feed twice a day, clean water, shelter from the elements. Those injuries need to be treated with antibiotic ointment and kept clean. Can you do that? Lily looked at Frost and Ember, at the way they stood close together as if drawing strength from each other's presence. She thought about her empty house, her father's absence, the art portfolio she was supposed to be preparing for college applications. She thought about her mother's final words, whispered through morphine haze, something about finding things worth fighting for. Yes, she said. I can do that. Good. Dr. Wells hefted her bags. I'll be back tomorrow to check on them. And Lily? She waited until Lily met her eyes. What you did took courage. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. She walked out into the gray afternoon, her truck's engine grinding to life, and drove away with chains of tire tracks in the snow. Mrs. Reeves came back inside, Tommy trailing after her. The boy went immediately to the foals, resuming his position between them as if he had never left. Well, the old woman said, we've stirred the pot now. No going back. She looked at Lily with something like fierce pride. Your grandfather would have done exactly the same thing. Exactly. And he'd be proud as hell watching you carry on what he started. Lily felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had cried enough these past 3 months, had given grief more than its share of her time. This was something different, something that required strength rather than surrender. She looked around the barn, at the foals she had named Frost and Ember, at Tommy sitting between them like a small guardian, at Mrs. Reeves watching over them all with her walking stick planted firm in the straw. This was her fight now. She hadn't chosen it, but she wouldn't walk away from it either. Outside, the storm's remnants continued to fade, leaving behind a world buried in white that would eventually thaw and reveal what lay beneath. Inside the barn, for unlikely souls waited for whatever came next, bound together by chance and choice, and the simple stubborn refusal to let cruelty have the final word. The afternoon light had turned pewter by the time Sheriff Holland's cruiser appeared at the end of the drive, moving carefully through ruts left by Dr. Wells' truck. Lily watched from the barn doorway, her stomach knotting as the vehicle approached. She had known this moment was coming since Mrs. Reeves mentioned Pete Morrison asking questions, but knowing didn't make it easier. Behind her, Tommy had fallen asleep sitting up against the wall, his head tilted at an angle that would give him a sore neck later. Frost and Ember stood nearby, drowsing in the warmth generated by their own bodies and the layered blankets. Sheriff Holland emerged from the cruiser, a tall man in his mid-40s whose face showed the weathering of too many Montana winters. He had been at her mother's funeral, standing in the back with his hat in his hands, and Lily remembered thinking even then that he looked like someone who carried other people's burdens as part of his job. He approached the barn slowly, boots crunching in snow that had started to refreeze as temperatures dropped again. Lily Brennan, he said by way of greeting. His voice was neutral, giving nothing away. Heard you had quite a night. Mind if I take a look at what you found? Lily stepped aside, gesturing him into the barn. The foals lifted their heads at the intrusion, Ember shifting its weight to stand behind Frost in a defensive posture that would have been more effective if they weren't both barely tall enough to reach an adult's waist. Sheriff Holland stopped just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light. When he saw the foals, something flickered across his face too quick for Lily to identify. Then his professional mask settled back into place and he moved closer with the same careful approach Dr. Wells had used. Dr. Wells sent me her preliminary report, he said, crouching to examine the injuries on Frost's leg without touching, along with about 40 photographs documenting what she found. He straightened, pulling a notebook from his pocket. I need you to walk me through everything from the beginning. Don't leave anything out, even if it seems unimportant. Lily did, starting with her walk home through the storm and ending with Dr. Wells' departure an hour earlier. Sheriff Holland wrote steadily, occasionally asking for clarification on timing or specific details. His questions were thorough but not aggressive, the queries of someone trying to build an accurate picture rather than trap her in inconsistencies. When she finished, he flipped back through his notes, frowning at something only he could see. The chains you cut are still by the creek? He asked. Yes. I left everything where it was except the bolt cutters. Those are here. Good. I'll need to collect all of it as evidence. He looked at the foals again, his expression hardening. This wasn't neglect. This was intentional cruelty with the purpose of disposal. Someone wanted these animals dead in a way that couldn't be traced back to them. The storm would have buried them within a day or two, made it look like they wandered off and got caught in the weather. Lily felt sick. She had understood on some level that the chains were deliberate, but hearing it stated so baldly made the reality undeniable. Who would do that? She asked. What could foals this young have done to deserve being killed? Sheriff Holland tucked his notebook away. That's what I intend to find out. Pete Morrison mentioned someone's offering a reward for information about missing foals. I made some calls, did some checking. The reward's being offered by a man named Vernon Gates. He runs a breeding operation about 30 miles north of here, claims 2 of his most valuable foals disappeared from a trailer during transport 3 nights ago. He closed the trailer at his property, drove to a sale in Billings, and when he arrived the foals were gone. That doesn't make sense, Lily said. If they escaped during transport, they'd be scattered along the highway, not chained by my grandfather's creek. Exactly. Sheriff Holland's eyes were sharp now, focused with the intensity of someone following a trail, which means either Gates is lying about how he lost them, or someone else took them and brought them here. Either way, we've got theft, animal cruelty, and potentially fraud if Gates is trying to collect insurance on animals he deliberately disposed of. Tommy had woken during the conversation, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. Are you going to arrest somebody? He asked, his voice still thick with sleep. Sheriff Holland looked at the boy with something close to kindness. Going to try, son. But first I need evidence that'll hold up in court. He turned back to Lily. I'm placing these foals under protective custody pending investigation. That means they stay here with you as temporary guardian, but they're legally under county supervision. Nobody can take them without a court order, including Gates if he shows up claiming ownership. You understand? Lily nodded, relief and new worry tangling together. How long will the investigation take? Depends on what I find. Could be days, could be weeks. In the meantime, you keep doing what you're doing. Feed them, keep them warm, document everything. Dr. Wells will check on them regularly and report to me. If anyone comes around asking questions or making threats, you call me immediately. He handed her a card with his direct number written on the back. Day or night doesn't matter. This is an active investigation and witness intimidation's a crime I take seriously. After Sheriff Holland left to photograph and collect the chains from the creek, Lily felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily onto her shoulders. Protective custody sounded official and safe, but it also meant she was now formally involved in whatever legal battle was coming. Her father would have opinions about that when he finally made it home. Strong opinions, probably expressed at high volume, about his teenage daughter inserting herself into situations that could turn dangerous. Mrs. Reeves had left an hour earlier, taking Tommy with her over his protests. The boy wanted to stay, to sleep in the barn and help care for Frost and Ember, but his grandmother had been firm. School tomorrow if the road's clear, she had said. And your parents are expecting a phone call tonight. Tommy had extracted a promise from Lily that she would tell the foals he'd be back soon. A promise she kept after they left, even though she felt foolish speaking to horses as if they understood English. Night fell early this time of year, darkness claiming the valley by 5 o'clock. Lily set up a camping lantern in the barn, its LED glow harsh and blue-white but bright enough to work by. She mixed more feed for the foals, this time adding some of the supplements from her grandfather's old stock after checking expiration dates and deciding they probably wouldn't do harm, even if they didn't do much good. Frost ate with the same calm focus it brought to everything, while Ember circled the bucket twice before diving in with enthusiasm that bordered on aggression. While they ate, Lily explored more of the barn's contents. In addition to the tack room and office, she found a storage area that held old furniture covered in drop cloths, boxes of her grandfather's personal effects that nobody had wanted to sort through after his death, and a filing cabinet that proved to be unlocked. Inside she found records going back 40 years, documenting not just the horses he had trained but the entire operation of a working ranch. Bills of sale, breeding records, veterinary reports, correspondence with clients. An entire business preserved in paper and fading ink. One file caught her attention, labeled simply problem cases in her grandfather's neat handwriting. Inside were records of horses other trainers had given up on, animals with behavioral issues or trauma histories that made them dangerous or untrainable by conventional methods. Her grandfather had taken them in, worked with them for months or sometimes years, and eventually either rehabilitated them enough to return to their owners or found them new homes where their particular needs could be met. The notes were detailed, tracking daily progress or setbacks, documenting what techniques worked and which made things worse. Lily found herself reading late into the evening, the camping lantern casting shadows that jumped with every small movement. One case in particular held her attention, a young mare who had been beaten by a previous owner until she trusted no one. Her grandfather's notes tracked 18 months of patient work, of standing in her presence without demands, of offering food and water and expecting nothing in return. The mare's transformation had been gradual, measured in inches rather than miles, but by the end of the file she had learned to accept touch and eventually even a saddle. Not because she had been forced, but because she had chosen to trust. The approach felt familiar somehow, though Lily couldn't place why until she looked up and saw Ember watching her from across the barn. The dark foal stood alert, ears forward, no longer seeing her as a threat but not yet accepting her as safe. Somewhere between fear and trust, waiting to see which side she would prove herself to be on. Lily closed the file carefully, returning it to the cabinet, and approached Ember with empty hands and no expectations. She sat down in the straw about 6 feet away, making herself small and unthreatening. Ember snorted, muscles tensing, but didn't retreat. Frost ambled over after a moment, curious about this new behavior, and lowered its head to sniff Lily's hair. The pale foal's breath was warm and sweet with the smell of grain, its muzzle soft as velvet when it bumped against her shoulder. Lily remained still, letting Frost investigate her while keeping her attention on Ember. Minutes passed, 10, then 15. Lily's legs started to cramp from sitting cross-legged, but she didn't move. The camping lantern hummed softly, its battery slowly draining. Outside, wind picked up again, rattling the barn's loose boards and whistling through gaps in the walls. Ember took one step closer, then another, closing the distance with agonizing slowness. When the dark foal finally reached out to touch Lily's extended hand with its nose, the contact lasted barely a second before Ember jerked back. But it was enough. A beginning, however tentative. Lily's phone buzzed in her pocket, startling all of them. She pulled it out to find a string of texts from her father, the messages growing increasingly frantic as they progressed. The roads had finally cleared enough for him to get through, and he was 2 hours out, driving fast despite the ice. The messages demanded explanations, expressed worry and anger in equal measure, threatened consequences and grounding and other punishments that felt absurd given the circumstances. The final message simply read, "Stay put. We'll talk when I get there." She texted back that she was fine, that she'd explain everything when he arrived, that she was sorry for making him worry. Then she silenced the phone and tucked it away. The foals had settled again after the disruption, Frost lying down in the straw while Ember remained standing guard. Lily found more blankets and created a nest for herself against the wall, positioning it where she could watch both Foles and the door. She wasn't sure what she expected to happen, but the sheriff's warnings about witness intimidation had lodged in her mind and refused to leave. Sleep came in fragments, broken by every sound that penetrated the barn walls. The wind, the creak of old wood settling, the soft sounds of the foal's shifting position. Once she woke to find Ember standing over her, the dark foal's head lowered as if checking to make sure she was still breathing. Their eyes met in the lantern's dim glow, and Lily saw something in that gaze that looked almost like concern. Then Ember snorted and moved away, returning to stand near Frost, and Lily wondered if she had imagined the whole exchange. The sound of her father's truck engine jerked her fully awake sometime after midnight. She heard the vehicle door slam, heard boots crunching through snow, and then her father was there, filling the doorway with his height and the barely contained energy of someone who had spent hours driving while terrified. James Brennan was a big man, made bigger by the heavy coat and the emotion radiating off him like heat. His eyes found Lily first, scanning her for injury, then moved to the foals. His expression went through several transformations in rapid succession, landing finally on something that might have been understanding mixed with resignation. "Lily," he said, his voice rough, "what the hell have you gotten us into?" She stood, brushing straw from her jeans, and told him everything, from finding the foals in the storm to Sheriff Holland's visit that afternoon. Her father listened without interrupting, his jaw working as he processed information that clearly wasn't what he had expected to hear. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, just looking at Frost and Ember with an expression she couldn't read. "Your mother would have done the same thing," he finally said. Found something suffering and refused to look away. He rubbed his face with both hands, exhaustion showing in every line. "I can't decide if I'm furious or proud. Maybe both." He looked at Lily, really looked at her, and something in his face softened. "You've been different since she died. Quieter, like you were just going through motions. This is the first time in months you've looked like you're actually here instead of just existing." The observation caught Lily off guard, exposed something she hadn't realized was visible to others. "I didn't know how to be here," she admitted. "Everything felt wrong without her. Like the world had tilted and I couldn't figure out which way was up anymore." James moved into the barn, approaching the foals with caution. Frost watched him but didn't rise from where it lay in the straw. Ember shifted nervously, ready to flee but held in place by Frost's calm. Lily's father crouched slowly, keeping his movements small. "These ones have been through hell," he observed. "You can see it in how they hold themselves, waiting for the next hurt." "They're getting better," Lily said. "Tommy was here earlier and they let him touch them. Dr. Wells examined them without too much trouble. They're learning that not all humans are dangerous." Her father stood, dusting off his hands. "Sheriff Holland's right to be suspicious about this Gates character. Foals this young don't just disappear from a locked trailer during transport. Either he's lying about what happened or someone who works for him is involved." He looked at Lily with new seriousness. "This could get complicated. If Gates has money and lawyers, he might push back hard against losing valuable stock. Even if we prove he's responsible for what happened, he might still have legal claim to ownership." The thought made Lily's stomach clench. "So what do? We document everything. We cooperate with the investigation, and we hope the law comes down on the right side." James moved toward the door, then paused. "I need to get some sleep before I fall over, and you need real rest in a real bed. Can they manage without you for a few hours?" Lily looked at Frost and Ember, at the way they had settled into the barn's routines, at the water and feed she had left within reach. "They'll be okay. But I want to check on them first thing in the morning." Her father nodded. "First thing. We'll come back together." He waited while she gathered her things, the empty thermos and extra blankets, her phone and the camera Mrs. Reeves had loaned her. As they walked toward the cottage through snow that glowed silver under a moon finally visible now that clouds had cleared, James spoke again. "Your grandfather used to say that horses chose their people as much as people chose horses. That the best relationships were partnerships built on mutual respect rather than dominance." He glanced back at the barn. "I think maybe those two chose you last night, when you decided to stay instead of leaving them to the storm." Lily considered this as they reached the cottage, as her father unlocked the door and ushered her into warmth that felt almost painful after hours in the cold. The idea that she hadn't just rescued Frost and Ember but that they had somehow claimed her felt both strange and right. She thought about Ember's careful approach earlier, about Frost's easy acceptance, about the way they both seemed to relax when she was near. Maybe her grandfather had been right. Maybe the best relationships were the ones where both parties chose to stay. The cottage felt too warm, too bright, too clean after the barn's rough shelter. Lily showered until the hot water ran cold, scrubbing away dried blood from her torn hands and thawing fingers that had gone stiff with cold. She found her mother's bathrobe hanging on its usual hook and pulled it on, needing the comfort of familiar fabric even though wearing it made her throat tight. Her father had made tea, the mug sitting on the kitchen table next to a plate of sandwiches he must have thrown together from whatever wasn't spoiled in the refrigerator. They sat together in the kitchen's yellow light, eating in silence that felt less awkward than Lily had expected. Her father looked old suddenly, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered, gray showing more prominently in his dark hair. The months since her mother's death had aged him in ways that went beyond simple time passing. She wondered if she looked different too, if the night in the barn had marked her in some visible way. "Tomorrow we call your aunt," James said eventually. "Let her know what's happening. She'll want to help, probably show up with enough food to feed an army." He smiled slightly. "Your mother's sister never could resist a crisis that needed managing." Lily nodded, too tired to protest. Her aunt lived 2 hours away and had called weekly since the funeral. Conversations that always ended with offers to visit that Lily had deflected with practiced excuses. But maybe having another adult around wouldn't be the worst thing, especially if the situation with Vernon Gates escalated beyond Sheriff Holland's ability to contain it. She finished eating and stood, exhaustion pulling at her like an undertow. Her father caught her hand as she moved past, his grip gentle. "I'm glad you're okay. When Mrs. Reeves called and said you'd been out in the storm all night, I thought." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "Just glad you're okay." Lily squeezed his hand, the gesture saying what she couldn't put into words. Then she climbed the stairs to her room, to the bed that had been her mother's before it became hers, and fell into sleep so deep it felt like falling through darkness with no bottom in sight. She dreamed of horses running through snow, their manes streaming behind them like silver fire. She dreamed of chains that turned to water and melted away, of barns that grew into forests, of her mother's voice saying something important that Lily couldn't quite hear. She woke once to moonlight streaming through her window, illuminating the art supplies scattered across her desk, the unfinished college portfolio that had seemed so urgent before her mother got sick. Now it felt like an artifact from someone else's life, a goal that belonged to a different version of herself. Morning came too soon and too bright, sunlight reflecting off snow to create a glare that hurt her eyes. Lily dressed quickly, pulling on clean jeans and her warmest sweater, then layered her father's spare coat over the top since hers was still at the barn. James was already in the kitchen, coffee made and truck warming up outside. He handed her a travel mug without comment, and they drove the short distance to the barn in silence. The foals were awake and alert when they arrived, greeting Lily with soft whinnies that suggested they remembered her despite the hours apart. Her father watched as she went through the morning routine, mixing feed and checking water, examining the injuries on their legs with gentle fingers. Frost leaned into her touch now, completely relaxed, while Ember allowed the inspection with only minimal fidgeting. Progress, however small, however fragile. Dr. Wells arrived an hour later for her promised follow-up visit, pulling up in her green truck with the easy confidence of someone who had made this trip 1,000 times. She brought fresh supplies, antibiotic ointment and bandages and grain mixed specifically for young horses recovering from malnutrition. She also brought news that made Lily's brief moment of peace evaporate like morning fog. Vernon Gates filed a claim with the county this morning, Dr. Wells said, setting down her bags with more force than necessary, demanding immediate return of his property and threatening legal action against anyone who interferes. She looked at James. "You're going to want to get a lawyer involved. This isn't going to resolve itself quietly." James nodded, his expression grim. "Already made some calls. Got a friend who specializes in agricultural law willing to consult. She looked at the photos I sent and said we've got a strong case for animal cruelty charges, but proving Gates was directly responsible will be harder if he claims the foals were stolen from him. Dr. Wells began her examination of Frost, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The timing's too convenient. Foals go missing from his trailer, turn up chained and dying 30 miles away, and he immediately offers a reward? He's either involved or covering for someone who is. She moved to Ember next, noting with satisfaction that the dark foal was more accepting of her presence than it had been the previous day. They're healing well physically. Emotionally's going to take longer, but they're young enough that they might not carry permanent trauma if they get consistent good treatment from here on out. What happens if the court orders us to return them? Lily asked, voicing the fear that had kept her awake during the brief hours she had managed to sleep. Dr. Wells looked at her with an expression that held both sympathy and steel. Then we make sure the judge sees every photograph, reads every report, and understands exactly what condition these animals were in when you found them. We make returning them to Gates so uncomfortable and legally risky that he decides it's not worth the fight. And if that doesn't work, she added, her voice dropping, then we find another way. Legal system's not perfect, but it's not the only system that matters in a community like this. The words hung in the air, carrying implications Lily wasn't sure she wanted to examine too closely. But she understood the underlying message. Pinewood Valley took care of its own, and sometimes that care operated outside official channels. It was the same principle that had brought Mrs. Reeves through a blizzard with supplies, that had mobilized Grace Murphy to spread word through the community, that had neighbors offering hay and feed without being asked. The valley had decided Frost and Ember belonged here now, and Vernon Gates would find out what it meant to challenge that collective judgment. After Dr. Wells left, promising to return in 2 days for another check, Lily spent the morning working with the foals. Not training exactly since they were too young for formal work, but building on the foundation of trust that had started in the storm. She taught them to accept a soft rope around their necks, not tied but just resting there, getting them used to the sensation of being gently led. She brushed their coats with an old grooming tool from her grandfather's collection, working through tangles and removing the last traces of the ordeal they had survived. She spoke to them constantly, nonsense mostly, the sound of her voice becoming something familiar and safe. Tommy arrived mid-morning, released from school early due to lingering road conditions, and immediately took over the grooming process. His small hands were gentler than Lily's, his patience apparently infinite. He sang to the foals as he worked, children's songs about animals and adventures, and they responded to him in ways they didn't respond to anyone else. Ember particularly seemed drawn to the boy, following him around the barn and nickering when he stopped paying attention. By afternoon, the barn had become a hub of quiet activity. Mrs. Reeves stopped by with a casserole and more supplies, refusing to come inside because her hip was acting up but standing in the doorway to observe the foals with satisfaction. Grace Murphy from the feed store appeared with a truckload of hay and grain, waving off payment with a gruff assertion that the first load was always free for rescue cases. Even Pete Morrison, the rancher who had been asking questions, drove by and left a box of vitamin supplements on the doorstep with a note that read simply, "For the babies." The community was rallying, but Lily knew that support could evaporate quickly if Vernon Gates pushed back hard enough. Money and lawyers had a way of making people remember prior commitments and pressing concerns. For now, though, in the warmth of collective goodwill, she let herself believe that maybe everything would work out, that the foals would heal, that Gates would face consequences, that justice would prevail because it had to. She was brushing Frost's mane when her father called her name from outside, his tone carrying an urgency that made her stomach drop. She emerged from the barn to find him standing beside a black SUV she didn't recognize, talking to a man in an expensive coat whose body language radiated authority and barely contained anger. Even before introductions were made, Lily knew who this was. Vernon Gates had arrived, and the real fight was about to begin. Vernon Gates was not what Lily expected. She had built an image in her mind of someone crude and obviously cruel, a man whose malice would be written plainly across his features. Instead, Gates was polished and controlled, his silver hair styled perfectly despite the wind, his handshake firm when he extended it toward her father. He wore boots that cost more than most people's monthly rent and carried himself with the assurance of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through sheer force of presence. "Mr. Brennan," Gates said, his voice smooth as river stones, "I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I understand there's been some confusion about my property, and I'd like to clear that up before this becomes more complicated than it needs to be." James didn't take the offered hand. "There's no confusion. My daughter found 2 foals chained and dying in a blizzard. She saved their lives. Whatever claim you think you have ends there." Gates' smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I'm sure your daughter acted with the best intentions. However, those foals were stolen from my property 3 nights ago. I have registration papers, bills of sale, breeding records. They're worth approximately $15,000 each, and I want them returned immediately." Lily stepped forward before she could stop herself. If they're so valuable, why were they chained to a stake in a snowstorm? Why did someone want them dead badly enough to use industrial chains and padlocks? Gates turned his attention to her for the first time, his gaze assessing and dismissive in equal measure. "Young lady, I don't know what happened to my animals after they were stolen. That's a matter for law enforcement. What I do know is that I'm the legal owner, and keeping them from me constitutes theft." He pulled papers from his coat, unfolding them with deliberate care. Registration documents from the American Quarter Horse Association. Both foals are out of championship bloodlines. He held them out toward James. "You can verify everything I'm telling you." James took the papers, scanning them quickly. "These prove you own 2 foals. They don't prove these are the same ones. They don't explain how horses stolen from a locked trailer ended up chained 30 miles away. And they definitely don't explain the injuries Dr. Wells documented or the condition my daughter found them in. I've already filed a complaint with Sheriff Holland about the theft," Gates said, his tone hardening slightly. "And I've spoken with my attorney about the unauthorized retention of my property. If those foals aren't returned by tomorrow morning, I'll pursue legal action not just for their return, but for damages, veterinary costs, and compensation for the delay in their training schedule." Tommy had appeared in the barn doorway, his small face tight with concern. Behind him, Lily could see Frost and Ember watching through the gap, their ears pricked forward as if they sensed the tension in the adult voices. Gates followed her gaze and his expression shifted, calculation replacing irritation. "May I at least see them?" he asked, modulating his voice to something closer to reasonable. "Verify they're my animals before we proceed further? I'm sure you can understand my position. These foals represent a significant investment, and I have buyers waiting for them once they're old enough to begin training." James looked at Lily, the question clear in his eyes. She wanted to refuse, to keep Gates away from Frost and Ember, but she also understood that denying him would make them look like they had something to hide. She nodded once, sharply, and led the way into the barn. Gates entered with the same controlled movements he brought to everything, his eyes adjusting quickly to the dimmer light. Frost and Ember had retreated to the far corner, pressed against each other in the defensive posture Lily recognized from that first night. Gates moved toward them and both foals flinched, Ember actually rearing slightly despite its injured leg. The reaction was unmistakable and Gates froze, his mask of control slipping for just an instant. In that moment, Lily saw recognition flash across his face. He knew these horses, and they knew him. Sheriff Holland's truck appeared at the end of the drive before Gates could respond to the foal's reaction. The timing felt too perfect to be coincidence, and Lily suspected someone had called to report Gates' arrival. The sheriff emerged from his vehicle with the same measured calm he brought to everything, but his hand rested casually near his belt in a way that suggested readiness for trouble. "Mr. Gates," Sheriff Holland said by way of greeting. "Didn't expect to see you down here in person. Thought we agreed you'd work through official channels while the investigation proceeds." Gates turned, his composure restored. "I have the right to verify that animals matching the description of my stolen property are actually my animals. The registration papers clearly identify both foals by their markings." Sheriff Holland held out his hand for the papers, reading them slowly. "These describe a dapple gray colt and a bay filly with a white blaze. both born in May of last year. He looked past Gates to where Frost and Ember huddled in the corner. Those could be the same animals. They could also be two of about 50 foals born in Montana last spring that fit the same general description. Registration papers aren't the same as microchips or DNA verification. Both foals are microchipped, Gates said quickly. Check for the chips and you'll confirm ownership immediately. Dr. Wells didn't find any microchips during her examination, Sheriff Holland replied, which either means these aren't your foals or someone removed the chips. If it's the latter, that's evidence of a crime beyond the theft you reported. He folded the papers and handed them back. Here's what's going to happen. The foals stay in protective custody with the Brennan family while I complete my investigation. That includes interviewing everyone who had access to your property in the days before the alleged theft, examining your trailer for evidence of how the foals actually disappeared, and reviewing any financial records related to their purchase and insurance. You can't do that without a warrant, Gates protested, the smooth veneer cracking further. Already have one. Judge Carlisle signed it this morning based on Dr. Wells' report and the photographs of the injuries. Sheriff Holland's expression was neutral, but his eyes held something sharp. See, the thing about chaining animals and leaving them to die is that it tends to make judges cooperative when law enforcement wants to dig into who might have done such a thing. Especially when valuable registered stock is involved and insurance claims are pending. Gates' face darkened with anger barely held in check. This is harassment. I'm the victim here. My property was stolen and now I'm being treated like a criminal for trying to recover it. You'll be treated like whatever the evidence suggests you should be treated like. Until then, those foals aren't going anywhere. Sheriff Holland gestured toward the barn door. I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. You can direct any further questions to my office. For a moment, Lily thought Gates might refuse. His body language radiated fury, muscles tensed as if preparing for a fight that couldn't possibly end well for him. Then he forced his shoulders to relax, smoothed his expression back to something approximating civility, and nodded once. This isn't over, he said, directing the words at James rather than the sheriff. Those are my animals and I will get them back, along with compensation for every day they're kept from me. He strode to his SUV, the vehicle's engine roaring to life with unnecessary aggression. Gravel sprayed from beneath the tires as he accelerated down the drive, the black vehicle disappearing around the bend faster than was safe given the icy conditions. Sheriff Holland watched until it was out of sight, then turned back to Lily and her father. That went better than I expected, he said. Thought he might try something more aggressive. The sheriff moved into the barn, approaching the foals slowly. They were terrified of him. Did you see their reaction when he got close? Lily nodded. They knew him. Whatever happened to them, Gates was involved. Knowing it and proving it are different things. Sheriff Holland crouched near Frost, not close enough to touch but near enough to observe. I spoke with two of Gates' ranch hands this morning. One quit last week, said he couldn't stomach how Gates treated the younger stock. The other one's still there but scared enough that he's talking to me off the record. He pulled out his notebook, flipping to a marked page. According to the one who quit, Gates has been having financial problems. Overextended himself buying breeding stock at premium prices, counting on high-value sales that haven't materialized. The foals were supposed to be his big payday, but they weren't developing as fast as he wanted. He was paying for premium feed and care on animals that wouldn't be ready to sell for another year at minimum. So he decided to cut his losses, James said. Get rid of the expense and collect insurance money for stolen property. That's my working theory. Sheriff Holland stood, brushing straw from his knees. But theory doesn't hold. Up in court without evidence. I need proof he arranged for them to be dumped here, proof he knew where they were when he filed the theft report, proof the insurance claim was fraudulent from the start. His current ranch hand is willing to testify about the financial problems but not about anything criminal. Says he didn't see anything directly incriminating. What about the person who actually chained them here? Lily asked. Someone had to transport them, had to know this location. The creek's not visible from the road. Working on that. We found tracks near where you cut the chains, tire impressions that might match a specific vehicle if we can identify the right one. Also checking with the feed store to see if anyone bought chains matching the ones used. though that's a long shot. People don't usually pay with credit cards when they're planning a crime. Sheriff Holland looked at the foals again, his expression softening slightly. In the meantime, they're safe here. Gates knows I'm watching him now. He makes one wrong move and I'll have enough for an arrest warrant. After the sheriff left, promising to update them as soon as he had more information, Lily returned to her routine with the foals. But the encounter with Gates had shaken something loose in her, crystallized the reality that this situation could spiral beyond her ability to control it. Legal battles took time and money, resources her father didn't have in abundance. If Gates pushed hard enough, hired the right lawyers, manipulated the right systems, he might actually win despite the evidence of cruelty. Tommy seemed to sense her mood, his usual chatter subdued as he helped with evening feeding. "They're not going back to him," the boy said suddenly, his voice carrying a certainty that defied his 8 years. "Even if the judge says they have to, they won't go. We won't let them." Lily wanted to tell him that wasn't how the world worked, that legal rulings had to be followed regardless of fairness or justice. But looking at Tommy's determined face, at Frost and Ember eating peacefully from the bucket he held, she found she couldn't undermine his faith. Maybe he was right. Maybe the valley would find a way to protect its own, even if that way operated outside official channels. Dr. Wells returned that evening, her arrival unannounced but not unexpected. She brought more supplies and a grim expression that suggested she had heard about Gates' visit. The veterinarian examined both foals thoroughly, documenting their continued improvement with photographs and detailed notes. When she finished, she gestured for Lily and James to follow her outside, out of earshot from where Tommy remained with the horses. "I made some calls to colleagues who've dealt with Gates before," Dr. Wells said without preamble. "The man has a reputation. He's been investigated twice for animal welfare violations, but nothing stuck. Inspectors would show up and find everything in perfect order, as if someone had warned him they were coming. He's careful about covering his tracks. But not careful enough this time," James said. "We have photographs, medical documentation, witness testimony about the condition these foals were in. That has to count for something. Counts for a lot. But Gates has resources and connections. He's already hired a lawyer out of Billings who specializes in agricultural disputes. They're going to argue the foals were in good health when stolen, that any injuries occurred after they left his property, that he's a victim being persecuted by overzealous law enforcement and misguided rescuers." Dr. Wells looked at Lily. "They're going to make this about you. Your age, your emotional state after your mother's death, your supposed inability to think rationally. They'll paint you as a troubled teenager who inserted herself into a situation she didn't understand." Lily felt anger flare hot in her chest. "That's not what happened. I know that. Anyone who looks at the evidence knows that. But juries can be swayed by good lawyers and sympathetic defendants." She pulled an envelope from her coat. "This is contact information for a legal aid organization that handles animal welfare cases. They work pro bono for families who can't afford private attorneys. I already spoke with them about your situation and they're willing to take the case if Gates follows through with his threat to sue." James accepted the envelope, his expression grateful but worried. "We appreciate that, though I'm hoping it doesn't come to litigation. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst." Dr. Wells moved back toward her truck, then paused. "One more thing. I checked with the microchip company whose registration numbers appear on Gates' paperwork. Both chips were deactivated 4 days ago. Someone called in claiming the animals had died and requested the registrations be closed. That's not standard procedure for stolen animals." The implications hung in the cold air. Gates or someone working for him had reported the foals' dead days before they were supposed to have been stolen. Evidence of premeditation, of a plan that went beyond simple disposal. Sheriff Holland needed to know this immediately, and Dr. Wells promised to forward the information as soon as she reached a phone with reliable signal. That night, Lily couldn't sleep despite exhaustion that pulled at her bones. She lay in her childhood bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Gates' cold eyes and the way Frost and Ember had recoiled from his presence. She thought about her mother, who had believed deeply in doing the right thing even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. Her mother would have fought for these foals with everything she had, would have stood between them and anyone who tried to drag them back into cruelty. Sometime after midnight, Lily gave up on sleep and returned to the barn. Her father's truck was already there, light spilling from the open doorway. She found him sitting in the straw with the foals, both of them drowsing against his bulk while he read from one of her grandfather's training journals. He looked up when she entered, offered a tired smile. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "Figured I'd keep them company. Your grandfather wrote about a case similar to this. Mare that had been abused, seized by authorities, returned to her owner after a legal battle. She never recovered. Stopped eating, stopped responding to training. Just gave up." He closed the journal carefully. "I won't let that happen to these two." Lily settled beside him, Frost's warm weight against her shoulder. "What if we can't stop it? What if the law sides with Gates despite everything?" James was quiet for a long moment. "Then we make sure they're healthy enough and trained enough that wherever they end up, they have value beyond what Gates sees in them. We document everything so thoroughly that anyone who takes custody knows exactly what these foals need and what they've been through. We turn them into individuals instead of property, make them matter in ways that transcend ownership papers." Was a strategy born of pragmatism rather than optimism, an acknowledgement that sometimes the best you could do was minimize damage rather than prevent it entirely. But it was also something concrete, a plan that gave them agency in a situation that threatened to spiral completely beyond their control. Lily leaned against her father's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. For the first time since her mother's death, they felt like a family again. Broken and reconfigured, but still connected by something stronger than grief. The next week passed in a blur of routine punctuated by developments in the investigation. Sheriff Holland executed the search warrant on Gates' property, seizing financial records and interviewing employees. One ranch hand broke under questioning and admitted he had been the one to transport the foals to the creek, following Gates' orders but assured the animals would be picked up within hours. He claimed not to know Gates' plan to leave them chained through the storm, though his lawyer was already arguing coercion and reduced culpability. The insurance company that had issued Gates' policy suspended his claim pending the investigation, which seemed to accelerate Gates' legal response. He filed suit in county court demanding immediate return of the foals and $50,000 in damages for lost training time and emotional distress. The number was absurd, clearly calculated for intimidation rather than realistic compensation, but it meant the legal aid organization would now be actively involved. Lily met with the attorney, a woman named Patricia Chun who looked barely old enough to have graduated law school, but spoke with an authority that commanded immediate respect. Chun reviewed all the documentation, viewed the photographs, and interviewed both Lily and Dr. Wells extensively. By the end of their second meeting, she was smiling in a way that suggested she relished the coming fight. "This is one of the clearest cases of animal cruelty I've seen," Chun said, organizing papers into neat folders. "Combined with the deactivated microchips and the ranch hand's testimony, we can prove Gates planned this from the beginning. The question isn't whether you'll keep the foals. The question is how much trouble Gates ends up in when this is over." But the court date was still 3 weeks away, and 3 weeks felt like an eternity when every day brought new threats veiled as legal correspondence. Gates' attorney sent letters demanding access to the foals for independent veterinary examination. They filed motions to have Lily declared an unfit guardian based on her age and emotional state. They even tried to get Sheriff Holland removed from the investigation for bias, though that motion was denied so quickly it barely made it onto the docket. Through it all, Lily maintained her routine with Frost and Ember. The foals were thriving now, their coats glossy with health, their movements growing stronger and more confident. Frost had become something close to a companion, following Lily around the barn and nickering whenever she appeared. Ember remained more independent but had learned to accept touch and even seek it out occasionally, particularly from Tommy, who visited daily after school. The boy had appointed himself as the foals' primary advocate, telling anyone who would listen about how Lily had saved them and how Gates was trying to steal them back. His grandmother reported that Tommy had even given a presentation at school about animal welfare, using Frost and Ember as his central example. The teacher had been so impressed she'd contacted the local newspaper, which sent a reporter to interview Lily and photograph the foals. The article ran on the front page of the weekly edition, complete with pictures of Lily standing between frost and ember and quotes from Dr. Wells about the condition they had been found in. Gates' name was never mentioned directly, but the story made clear that the foals had been deliberately abandoned and that legal proceedings were ongoing to ensure their abuser faced consequences. The day the paper came out, Lily's phone started ringing with calls from supporters, with offers of donations to help cover legal costs, with messages from people as far away as Billings who wanted to help however they could. The community had spoken, and its voice was louder than Gates could have anticipated. Grace Murphy organized a fundraiser at her feed store, collecting enough money to cover 6 months of feed and veterinary care. The local diner started keeping a donation jar by the register, its contents growing daily. Even Pete Morrison, who had initially been asking questions on Gates' behalf, showed up with a check and an apology for not understanding the full situation sooner. But support from the Valley couldn't change the fundamentals of property law. When the court date finally arrived, Lily found herself sitting in a wood-paneled courtroom that smelled of furniture polish and old paper, watching as Gates' expensive attorney presented his case with practiced ease. The lawyer acknowledged that the foals had been found in poor condition but argued this proved they had been stolen and mistreated by unknown parties. He produced the registration papers, breeding records, and purchase receipts, building a case for ownership that technically was airtight. Patricia Chun responded with photographs that made people in the gallery gasp, medical reports that documented injuries inconsistent with short-term abandonment, and testimony from the ranch hand who described Gates' explicit instructions to make the foals disappear. She called Dr. Wells to the stand, who testified about the advanced state of malnutrition and the specific pattern of chain injuries. She called Sheriff Holland, who outlined the evidence of insurance fraud and premeditated animal cruelty. Then Chun called Lily. Walking to the witness stand felt surreal, like moving through water. She swore to tell the truth on a Bible whose leather cover was cracked with age and answered questions in a voice that only shook slightly. She described finding the foals in the storm, making the choice to stay despite the danger, cutting the chains in darkness while snow buried the world. She talked about Frost's gentle trust and Ember's hard-won acceptance, about Tommy's fearless care and the community's collective support. Gates' attorney tried to shake her on cross-examination, suggesting she had acted impulsively, that she couldn't possibly know what the foals had experienced before she found them, that her emotional state after her mother's death had clouded her judgment. Lily met his eyes and spoke clearly. "I know what I saw. I know those foals had been chained long enough for the metal to cut through hide to muscle. I know they recognized Vernon Gates when he came to my barn, and their reaction was pure terror. I know I couldn't walk away and let them die, and I don't regret that choice for a second." The attorney had no response to that. He returned to his seat looking less confident than when he had started. Judge Carlisle, a woman in her late 60s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her reputation for impatience with time-wasting, listened to closing arguments with an expression that gave nothing away. Then she announced she would issue her ruling within 48 hours and dismissed everyone until then. The waiting was excruciating. Lily spent those 2 days in the barn with Frost and Ember, trying not to think about what would happen if the judge ruled in Gates' favor. Tommy came every afternoon, his presence a steady comfort. Her father moved through routines with mechanical precision, cooking meals neither of them tasted, making calls to relatives who offered support but no solutions. The whole valley seemed to hold its breath. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Judge Carlisle had issued her written ruling, and Patricia Chun wanted to deliver it in person. Lily, James, Tommy, Mrs. Reeves, Dr. Wells, and Sheriff Holland gathered in the barn, the foals providing backdrop to whatever news was coming. Chun pulled out the official document, her face neutral until the last possible moment. Then she smiled. "The judge ruled in your favor on every count. Full custody remains with the Brennan family. Gates has been ordered to pay restitution for veterinary costs and damages. The county prosecutor is moving forward with criminal charges for animal cruelty and insurance fraud." She looked at Lily. "They're yours now. Legally, officially, permanently." The relief was so intense it felt physical, like a weight lifting from Lily's chest that she hadn't fully realized was there. Tommy let out a whoop of joy and threw his arms around Frost's neck. Mrs. Reeves wiped at her eyes with the corner of her scarf. Dr. Wells grinned wider than Lily had ever seen. James pulled his daughter into a hug that lifted her off her feet, his voice rough when he whispered that he was proud of her. Sheriff Holland cleared his throat, bringing order back to the celebration. Gates has 72 hours to vacate his property before his assets are seized to cover the restitution. He's facing up to 2 years in prison if convicted on all charges. The ranch hand who transported the foals took a plea deal and will testify against him. He looked at Lily. What you did, finding them and refusing to give up, that made all the difference. Without your photographs and your willingness to fight, Gates would have gotten away with this. The next few weeks passed in a haze of adjustment to their new normal. The barn that had been temporary shelter became permanent home. Lily and her father worked together to repair and improve it, replacing rotted boards and adding better heating for the coming winter. Tommy spent so many hours there that his grandmother joked about charging rent. The foals grew stronger daily, their playfulness emerging now that fear no longer dominated their lives. Spring arrived gradually, snowmelt swelling Willowbrook Creek and revealing the earth beneath months of white. Lily stood at the fence one afternoon watching Frost and Ember run through the pasture her father had cleared, their movements pure joy expressed through muscle and motion. They had survived what should have killed them and were thriving in ways that seemed miraculous given where they had started. Tommy appeared beside her, climbing the fence rail with the ease of practice. "Do you think they remember?" he asked. "The storm and the chains and being scared?" Lily considered this. "Maybe. But I think what they'll remember most is what came after. Being warm and safe and cared for. Having each other and having us." The boy nodded, satisfied with this answer. "When they're old enough, will you teach me to ride? My grandma says I'm too small, but I think if Frost doesn't mind, then it should be okay." "We'll teach you together," Lily promised. All 4 of us learning at the same time. Her father appeared from the barn carrying brushes and halters they had been working with the foals to accept. "Your aunt called. She's coming up this weekend to see the famous horses everyone's been talking about. Says she's bringing enough food to feed the whole valley." He joined them at the fence, watching the foals with an expression that held both contentment and lingering wonder. "Your mother would have loved this, seeing you fight for something and win." Lily leaned against his shoulder, feeling the truth of that. Her mother had believed in standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, in refusing to accept cruelty as inevitable. In the months since her death, Lily had felt lost, unmoored from purpose and direction. But Frost and Ember had given her something to fight for, a reason to wake up each morning that went beyond simple existence. The college portfolio still waited on her desk, unfinished and likely to remain that way. She had called the art school and deferred her application for a year, citing family circumstances that required her attention. The admissions counselor had been understanding, even encouraging, suggesting that life experience often informed art in ways classroom instruction couldn't match. Maybe in a year she would feel ready to leave the valley, to pursue dreams that had seemed so urgent before her world tilted sideways. Or maybe she would find new dreams here, ones that involved horses and community and the quiet satisfaction of daily care. Dr. Wells drove up the lane, her green truck bouncing through ruts left by spring melt. She emerged carrying yet more supplies and wearing an expression that suggested she had news. Lily braced herself for whatever was coming, but the veterinarian's smile was genuine as she approached. Vernon Gates pleaded guilty this morning. 2 years in prison, lifetime ban from owning horses, and full restitution to the county for prosecution costs. She set down her supplies and pulled out her phone, showing them a news article. "The prosecutor used your case to launch a broader investigation into his breeding operation. Turns out he'd been cutting corners on care for years, masking malnutrition and neglect with strategic photography and falsified health records. They found 6 more horses on his property in similar condition to what you found. All of them are being rehomed through rescue organizations. So he can't hurt anyone else," Tommy said, his voice fierce with satisfaction. "Not like this." Dr. Wells began her now routine examination of the foals, checking their progress with the same thoroughness she brought to every visit. You two have exceeded every expectation for recovery. She looked at Lily. You did something remarkable here. Not just saving their lives, but giving them a reason to trust again. That's harder than the physical healing. As spring deepened into early summer, the barn became a destination for people throughout the valley who wanted to see the foals that had survived impossible odds. Lily found herself telling the story over and over, each repetition making it feel more real and more surreal at the same time. Some visitors brought gifts, supplies, or money, or simply their time. Others came just to witness proof that sometimes the right thing prevailed, that cruelty didn't always win. On a June evening when the light lasted until almost 9 o'clock, Lily sat in the pasture with Frost's head resting heavy on her lap while Ember grazed nearby. Tommy had gone home an hour earlier, his grandmother finally putting her foot down about bedtime. Her father was in the cottage making dinner, the smell of grilling meat drifting across the yard. The world felt peaceful in a way it hadn't since before her mother got sick. She thought about the girl she had been that January night, trudging through a blizzard with nothing but grief and going through motion's existence. That girl had stumbled on something that needed her when she most needed to be needed. The foals had given her purpose at a moment when purpose felt impossible, had reminded her that the world still held things worth fighting for even after loss hollowed you out. Frost shifted, blowing warm air against her hand. Ember lifted its head, ears swiveling toward some sound only horses could hear. In the distance, Willowbrook Creek sang its endless song, water over stone, ice melted into flow. The same creek that had almost been their grave had become part of their sanctuary, marking the border of land where they would grow and thrive, and eventually teach others what they had learned about survival and trust. Lily stood, brushing grass from her jeans, and whistled the foals toward the barn. They came without hesitation now, Frost leading while Ember followed close behind. Inside the barn that had been built by her grandfather's hands and restored by her own, she measured out their evening feed and checked their water. The routine was so familiar now it required no thought, her hands moving through tasks while her mind wandered to the future spreading out before them all. There would be challenges ahead. Training as the foals matured, decisions about their eventual purpose, the ongoing work of maintaining trust they had fought so hard to build. But Lily felt ready for it in ways she hadn't felt ready for anything since her mother's diagnosis. She had learned that sometimes the things that save you are the things you choose to save. That healing moves both directions, flowing between wounded souls until boundaries blur, and what was separate becomes connected. Her father appeared in the doorway, backlit by the setting sun. "Dinner's ready when you are." He watched her with the foals for a moment, then added, "You know your grandfather would have said you have the gift. That way with horses that can't be taught, only recognized." "Maybe," Lily said, "or maybe I just couldn't stand to let one more thing die." She secured the stall door, double-checking the latch out of habit. "Either way, they're here and we're here and that's enough." They walked back to the cottage together, leaving the barn door open so the foals could see out into the gathering dusk. Behind them, Frost and Ember settled into their straw bedding, comfortable in the knowledge that morning would bring familiar voices and gentle hands. The winter that had tried to kill them felt impossibly distant now, buried beneath months of patient care and slow-built trust. Lily paused at the cottage door, looking back one more time. The barn glowed with lamplight, a beacon against the darkening sky. Inside that light, 2 young horses drowsed in safety they had earned through survival. And standing on the threshold between barn and home, Lily Brennan felt something she had thought lost forever in the aftermath of her mother's death. She felt whole. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.